Hi, I'm Ed Stetzer, Director of Lifeway Research. We're continuing our series on comeback churches, specifically looking in this session on the issue of worship. Of course, when you even mention that, it makes some people nervous. People wonder, well, are we going to promote this worship style over this worship style? Is the answer for churches to be contemporary or for churches to be traditional? And the answer is none of the above. The answer is for churches to give worship to God. And we'll talk about what we learned as we went through some of this research in this process. As we go through our time together today, I want to first start by the fact that worship matters. The worship issue was an issue that was consistently mentioned, consistently considered, consistently a point of controversy, but consistently essential. Comeback churches are churches that value worship. Almost all comeback churches identified their mood as celebrative and orderly, and that's why we've called this session Celebrative Worship. Now, celebration means different things. It doesn't necessarily mean that every worship style will look alike, but there is a sense that when we gather together for worship, it is for celebration. There is something worth celebrating that we have to focus on, that we have to talk about. And we heard over and over again stories that churches that discovered their passion for God and His mission often by examining their worship. Now, some people think it's just a quick fix. We just kind of jazz up the worship. It's not. The solution lies more in seeking God's heart and finding worship that help people connect to God. In many cases, the worship of many churches that were stuck, plateaued, and declining, was once meaningful, but has lost much of its meaning to the community. In other words, the church once embraced more fully this is celebrative worship, but then they've lost that focus. And so worship is an essential part of this process. It cannot end the refocusing process, but it's often been the beginning. Many of the churches that we talk to actually, in fact, we start with a couple of stories in the chapter, many of the churches we talk to actually began their transformation by focusing on their worship first. And so we know worship is biblical command. We look at Psalm 100, verses 1 and 2. Shout to the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord with gladness. Come before Him with joyful songs. Well, I think the question we have to ask is, does this characterize your church? Is your church coming before Him with joyful songs? If so, then it lines up both with the biblical command and also with the research that we found. More importantly, of course, the biblical command. And so again, another dimension of worship, how it can influence people, even unbelievers can be influenced by worship. Now, unbelievers can't, by definition, worship. They're not believers. But ultimately, what happens is that worship can impact unbelievers. Unbelievers can see true worshipers focused on God, experiencing His presence through genuine praise and worship. And so they can see they're lacking something, some intimacy, some reason to celebrate in the process. Let's talk about worship style. That's what so many people want to get to when you talk about worship. Well, is there a style? No, there's no magic bullet when it comes to worship styles. As a matter of fact, thinking that is actually probably a hindrance in many churches, because people will come and say, well, if we just do this, then our church will grow. Well, no, changing a worship style won't cause your church necessarily to grow. Could be part of that solution. Some churches in our study made a transition from traditional to contemporary. Matter of fact, we should say that there are more churches in our study that were contemporary than were traditional. And so that's not an uncommon transition. It would be unfair to the research to say that these churches were not more contemporary than traditional. However, not all comeback churches were contemporary. Some were blended. And there was a significant number that were blended. There were also traditional churches that experienced significant revitalization. And so all different kinds of churches were there. Now, we didn't ask the respondents to name their style of worship. And the reason is those terms have come to be pretty meaningless over time. Is that, well, what kind of church is that? Well, we have a blended church. I have a friend who tells me his church is a blended church, a blend of the 16th and 17th centuries. And so what does that mean? What is a blended church? What is a contemporary church? To some people, a contemporary church is a church that uses a couple of choruses. And so we didn't ask them to name their worship style, but instead, we asked them to tell us, for example, about the musical instruments that they use in church, thinking that might give us a window into the way that they did church. And you might find it interesting, for example, that 30% of comeback churches used an organ in their worship service. 61% had a keyboard, 62% had drums, 71% had guitar, as well as 71% had a piano. And so we see kind of a consistency. Now, 30%, you can probably guess if 30% have an organ, that might be more traditional or blended, and you can probably guess those who have a drums and guitar might be more contemporary. So comeback churches were more contemporary than traditional, but at the same time, there's a lot of different expressions of worship that were there. Matter of fact, we asked the question, what kind of music do you use? And 59% said they use contemporary Christian, 75% said traditional hymns, and 90% said they use praise choruses. So there's a real diversity of worship styles. But there's some clear things that were in common. And one of those things that believers found the worship celebrative. They came to celebrate. And there were others. Celebrative was the leading category, but there was orderly, informal, contemporary, expressive. Those were some of the leading ways that they defined their churches. But there was a sense of orderliness there as well. Now, when we look at those things, we have to ask the question, what is it that we're called to do? How do we address worship style issues? Well, let's just be blunt. Few pastors survive a worship change, but most comeback churches did. Most comeback churches had some worship change, and your church might need to make some change in worship as well. So how are you going to do that? How can you lead the church to consider new ways to express themselves through worship? Well, first of all, make sure that there's a biblical foundation for everything that you do, and teach what the Bible says about worship. Sometimes we confuse our preferences with biblical commands. That's probably too weak. Very frequently, we confuse our preferences with biblical commands. If we like it, it must be the biblical way to worship, and that's a pretty loose way to define the issue of how we worship in our churches. But here's some ways that we'd suggest, maybe some practical ways. First, I would suggest that you list the churches in your area that are growing and are known. One of the reasons they're growing is through worship that's connecting people with God and doing so in a meaningful way. That's a celebrative way. And I'd actually list them out and actually visit them. I had led a church through this process, and what we did is we canceled church for 2 weeks, and we went and visited churches that had made worship a transition in worship in one way or another, and were effectively reaching people. And we went and saw what was there. What you might find is that many people have perceptions about worship that maybe has more to do with their bias and their own practice in their church. Maybe they haven't been out and seen what God is doing as people worship in different worship styles. And so I think ultimately is that we need to recognize that a couple things that may help. Churches that are growing by reaching people through evangelism generally look different than those in need of revitalization, and to be honest, they often look different in the area of worship. Also, they tend to make sure that their worship service is not rote, is not stuck, but instead is celebrating the things of God and bringing people into the presence of God. And so what I encourage you to do is pick some churches, perhaps from your denomination, and screen them. Don't go into churches that are maybe they're well known, but they're well known because they've got theological problems. Pick churches that are theologically similar to where you are, and with biblical preaching and a focus on God-centered worship, and maybe find ones with have maybe more than a certain number of an attendance. If you're a small church, you might want to make comparable sized churches. You might not want to go from a church if your church is running 50 people to a church of 5,000. Maybe for one of the visits you might learn something from there, but I would encourage you to do something that has a certain number of people or scaled to the size of your area, blank number of people that has grown perhaps 10-20% each year for the last few years, and aren't known for any major negative issues of theology or practice or conflict. And don't go to churches, Pastor, if you're picking out these churches, don't go to churches that simply fit your agenda, but pick the 5 that are growing and have expressive, exuberant worship services, and go see the celebrative worship in this community. Think of it kind of like your spies. Like in the Old Testament, you're spying out the land and identifying the challenges as what could take place in healthy worship. I would also encourage you to consider trying some different worship in your own church. Now, for you to show up one Sunday and say, well, this Sunday, if we're a contemporary church, we're going to be traditional, or, this Sunday we're a blended church, but we're going to be contemporary. Don't do that. But maybe identify with your church that you're going to do some experiments. You're going to take a few weeks and worship in some different ways. I've had the privilege of doing this at some churches. It's been a great experience. I would take churches typically through 4 worship expressions, and these worship expressions are just ones that I would, these are names that we made up. There's no magical connection between them, but we had one that did traditional worship and did it well. I think my personal preference is probably more traditional, holy, holy, holy hymns, like crown him with many crowns, and with a pipe organ and a trumpet, and so we do that well and let people see this is what traditional could look like well. Then the next week we did blended traditional. Blended traditional is kind of that a couple of hymns, maybe some choruses. Blended contemporary, perhaps maybe a contemporized hymn with some people clapping along and some choruses, and then even contemporary. And these are just descriptions, but I think ultimately experiencing different expressions of worship is something that we always do when we travel on the international mission field. Maybe some of you watching have been overseas and you've worshiped in different ways in Asia or Africa or South America, and yet the irony is that we say it's okay there, but the very thing we require international missionaries to do, which is to engage their culture in one way through worship, we forbid North American churches to do. And I think ultimately we need to ask some hard questions about what biblical worship is and how that biblical worship is lived out. And so again, what I would suggest is experience some different worship in your church. Visit some churches that are worshiping differently to learn from them, particularly if they're growing when you're not. Learn from that. Listen to them. Don't automatically assume that they're bad because they're growing. In many towns, the way to get a bad reputation is just to grow. People will assume you're doing it with illegitimate reasons. And it might be that they're reaching some people in fresh new ways. But then bring it home and discuss. Here's what I encourage you to do. Just maybe here's some questions that are very applicable you can jot down. Ask the question, what are these churches doing? Why are they doing it? And what impact is it having? And then you might ask some questions. If your church is stuck and stagnant, what are we doing different? And why is what we're doing not working? Now, those are hard questions to ask. Are you saying that what they're doing is working and what ours is not? Well, you can define working in a lot of ways. If you're being biblically faithful, you could say, well, that's all we need to do. But ultimately, if they're reaching people and you're not, and you're in the same community, I'd really want to know why. And I'd be honest enough to ask those hard questions. And then I'd ask, what can we learn? What can we learn on this journey? What about what they're doing can we learn from? And then lastly, and here's the most dangerous of it all, here's the fourth question, okay? It's, what are these churches doing? What is our church doing? What can we learn? Here's the dangerous one. What can we try? Is to think, what could we incorporate or implement into our church? Now, this will be the thing that gets you in trouble. And it'll get you in trouble because what will happen is that people will say, well, we're changing things. Well, here's the reality. If you start here and you don't help people to face reality, you don't have visional leadership to lead them to consider these things, they're not winning people to Christ, people aren't mobilized, and you just say we're going to change the worship and that's the answer, then you're going to fail at the task. But ultimately, you can't run away from the worship issue. Every church I've had the privilege of leading through a process, 3 churches I've led through, all of them had to address the worship issue. And by the way, all of them did not become contemporary churches, but they all re-examined their worship, changed their worship in some cases drastically in order to engage their communities more effectively. So again, changing worship and dealing with worship is a very common and a very essential practice. Let me talk about some flashpoints that'll take place here. One of the things to remember is that most people are unaware of this, but they have confused, and anthropologists, people who study culture, tell us they've confused meaning and form. They know they're supposed to worship. They know they're supposed to give honor to God, but what they've done is they've convinced the only way they can do that is from the form that they've grown up with. And really, depending upon your age, you've grown up with a different form of worship. If you grew up in the 70s, as I grew up in the 70s, your worship expression was a little bit different than people who grew up in the 50s or in the 40s. And what happens is we kind of get locked into that the way we can worship, and you'll hear people say this, is that some song they love, and it's typically a song they grew up with, or maybe when they came to Christ, it was a song they sang as an early believer. That song is sung, you'll see their face light up, and they'll just sing it with all their heart, and they'll say things like, we really worship today. Well, a mark of maturity is not that we worship on one day, but that we worship on every day. We worship when we gather together. A mark of maturity is not that we can only worship with songs we grew up with, but we can also worship with songs that are different. I'm always grieved when I look at churches that are maybe blended churches, and one group of people sings one group of music. Perhaps the older adults sing the hymns, and the younger adults sing the choruses. And I think that's a sign of great immaturity and a sign of danger in a church, because what we've done is we've said we can only worship through this form rather than expressing the biblical meaning. The reality is God can and does use all forms of music for His glory and honor. There's no such thing as Christian music. There's only Christian lyrics. And our task is not to go about and propagate our own preferences, but instead to really focus in on how can this community worship God in spirit and truth, which really leads to the question, maybe the big question, is how do we pick a style of worship in our church? And that's a big issue, and it's a dangerous issue, but it's an issue you'll have to face, because if you don't, what you do is you pick one by default. What happens is the most vocal people on one side of the issue and the most vocal people on the other side of the issue kind of force the people in the middle to just say, well, we'll do whatever. Because if you don't sing too many of these, we won't sing too many of those, and we create a truce, and often we end up with a worship service that nobody likes. And ultimately, I think the wrong question is, what's my preference? I look to Scripture in Philippians, right before the great canonic hymn, where it says that Jesus, speaking of Jesus, said, that he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. Well, right before that, it says, have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, and who existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God something to be grasped, that emptied himself. It says, and right before that, it says, we should think more highly of others, that we should look out for others' interests before our own. So maybe the answer is not for this age group and this age group to have a worship war. Been books written on worship wars, and nobody won the worship wars. What ended up happening is that the church was hurt. Maybe the answer is not, what's my preference? The answer is, what would bring the most glory to God by causing the most people in this community, maybe not even in our church right now, but in this community, to worship God in spirit and in truth. And if that's our motivation, then what will happen is it won't be about us. It's not about you. What a great phrase. It's not about you. It's about God. It's about God being honored through worship. It's about God-centered worship. And it's about God's people saying it's not about my preferences, but what would bring the most glory and honor to God to this context. Worship's always a contentious issue. Every generation hates the music of the next generation. That's always going to be the case. But in the process, if we don't navigate through these worship issues, your church will be divided over them. And a divided church is not a church that's going to be a comeback church. Now, I will tell you that the comeback churches we studied did not always report that their worship transitions were affirmed by everybody. The reality is there are always people who are going to be displeased. But that's the nature of churches. We're filled with imperfect, sinful people like me and like you. And so if that's the case, if we're filled with sinful people, we would expect people to make it about them. That's what sinful people do. That's what I do. Sometimes I make it all about me, and that's one way it's expressed through worship. But my exhortation to you would be is to ask the hard questions about what your worship expression might look like. Now, there are choices that need to be made, and most churches don't think through this issue. Most churches, when given the choice between their traditions and their children, they tend to choose their traditions every time, and we see that in churches all across North America. Churches have said, we're going to keep doing it this way, even if our kids want it a different way. And then what happens, and it grieves me, what happens is it's the church down the road with the young people go to, and a church up the road where the senior people go to, and I just can't imagine that God is glorified that we divide our church generationally. But what has to happen is it can't be about either of us. It has to be about how can God receive the most glory, worship by people in this community, and what contextual form is most appropriate. And I want you to know that's the term, and we'll close with this. The term that's appropriate that I want you to consider is how can we be contextual? Appropriate worship for our context. When you're worshiping among the Pokot in Africa, or among the Iban in Malaysia, or you're worshiping among the Quechua in the highlands of Peru, they worship differently because they're in a different context. Well, the question I would ask for you is, what's your context? Think it through, and then ask the question, what form of music and worship, and worship is more than music, but what form of music and worship would God use in this context to bring himself the most glory and honor? It's not about me, not about my preferences as a pastor or as a leader. It's not about the different factions in the church, but we all lay it down at the foot of Jesus and say, how can we have celebrative worship here that transforms our lives and transforms this community so the name and fame of Jesus will be more widely known? We're going to talk next time about the issue of how churches, comeback churches, had a renewed focus on the person of Jesus Christ and the mission of his church, one of the key faith factors we found in the research project.